Aloha, I'm Beth Ann Kozlovich, and thank you for tuning in to GMO Week on Olelo. From a Hawaii perspective, it's essential to question the impact of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, on our environment, lands, resources, and the effects they have on our community and public policy. But many of us don't know where to start with such a complex issue. How do you separate the real fact from emotional bias? That's what we hope to do this week in a series of programs to explore and explain some of the pros and cons of GMOs. If you visit olelo.org/GMO, you'll be able to watch these GMO discussions on demand. And you can tune in to a live GMO debate and even participate by tweeting your questions to #OleloGMO. The national conversation has moved on from just are you pro or anti-GMO to the right to know what's in the food we buy. Should any food made with GMOs be labeled? And what should the label specify so anyone can make an informed choice? This program is the first of 2 half-hour segments. I'll be talking to activists who are anti-GMO. First, a video presented by our panelists.
Aloha, I'm Tulsi Gabbard, and I have the privilege and honor of representing Hawaii's 2nd District here in the United States Congress. The citizens of Hawaii do not currently have the ability to know if their food has been genetically engineered or not. This concerns me, and I think you should be concerned as well. I hope you'll join me, Senator Russ Ruderman, Representative Jessica Woolley, and Councilman Gary Hooser in supporting the labeling of genetically engineered foods. Mahalo.
Now, islands are very fragile, and yet the most lethal planting material has not just been imported here, but is being multiplied here by the biotech industry.
GMOs are the most destructive thing happening in Hawaii today.
Those poisons are going in your food. They're in the air you breathe, the water you drink every day. We need to stop those poisons.
We're ground zero for this chemical corn, chemical soy, these experimental field crops of transgenic commodity crops that have been crossed without any disclosure.
These are pesticide companies. They've bought up much of the seed supply. Monsanto in particular has prohibited seed savings, so farmers always have to go back to the companies to buy new seed each year.
The use of herbicides in these GMO trials in Hawaii is magnitudes greater than what's used in conventional agriculture. Conducting field tests of GMO seeds is a completely different story from regular production of crops.
In an island where we should have diversity and is a garden island, you are getting the worst of violent agriculture-like war.
The biotechnology companies often say that overall genetically engineered crops cut pesticide use. In fact, overall it increases pesticide use 115 million more pounds a year.
January 15, 2012, OAHU was hit with a pretty bad dust storm coming from Monsanto's fields. Shortly after, our son, who was 6 months at that time, developed a really bad cough. And it was so bad that we had to take him to the emergency room. When I saw that our family was directly affected by living near these fields, I decided to get involved to research these companies and to find out what it was that they were doing on our island.
Money is a key driver in this debate. The GMO companies fund the public institutions to do research on their behalf. It's very difficult to find support for independent researchers who want to study the negative impacts of GMO crops on the environment or human health.
In recent ads, Monsanto says that these genetically engineered crops will feed the world. Nothing could be further from the truth. As a matter of fact, in 2009, the Union of Concerned Scientists came out with a report called Failure to Yield. Not one of these genetically engineered crops actually increases yield, not one. The vast majority of these crops are corn and soy. Over 95% of all corn and soy is used for cars and to feed cattle. And that is not something that most poor people who are starving need.
For 1 pound of factory farm beef, you need roughly 16 pounds of GMO feed. Economically, that simply does not work without subsidies. So we're directly subsidizing this with our tax dollars. The true costs are the ones that we bear, the costs that these companies don't capture in their financial reports and balance sheets, the healthcare costs associated with loss of work time and quality of life. How about the dead soil and the water that pesticides leave behind for us to deal with? If you don't really calculate these things, the companies are essentially making a profit while others are bearing the costs.
2011, hundreds of Waimea residents filed suit to protect their town and community from dust and pesticides from DuPont Pioneer's GMO research operation in Waimea. But what this example of Waimea shows is that you cannot trust these companies.
We are going to be successful if we all join together and rise together in unity.
Yaka akau ikalani, o ki ha ikalani, o e ikalani, nunu ikalani,
GMO! On our island, we fight for love. Feet on the ground, planted to the aina, and we fight for tomorrow.
Now that you've listened to me, take that information, take that knowledge, and now you go forth.
We are setting that example for the next generation.
Gentlemen, we've all seen the video just now, and we've heard a lot of the national conversation. It's moved away from just, are you pro-GMO or are you anti-GMO? It's really coming down to the right to know, period. I want to start with you, Walter, because you are in a small place geographically as far as the rest of the world is concerned, but it's your home and it's a very big place to you. And there are a lot of acres that Monsanto has control over on Molokai. Give us a snapshot of what's going on.
Well, on Molokai, it's important to understand that Monsanto has become the largest employer on our island. So that is a major economic impact for Molokai. And they're using up several thousand acres of our farmlands, and we got limited farmlands. And we also got limited water resources for those farmlands. So what's happening on Molokai is that we're taking the natural resources that we have for our future generations and we're placing it into the hands of Monsanto. So we need to understand what that means to our island, and we need to understand if that is a good thing or is that a bad thing.
Factually based though, what does that mean for Molokai? You say most people are employed by Monsanto. How many people? What kind of dollars are we talking about?
I don't know the dollars. All I know is that you're talking a couple hundred people that are employed at Monsanto. And the population is only 7,000 people on Molokai. So as far as impact is concerned, it's a major impact. So it's very difficult to resolve the problem because you have those that are worried about the environmental impacts, the health impacts, and all those kinds of impacts, and then those that are worried about the economic impacts. So there's a natural collision going on our small island.
And that's not the only place where it's happening. Gary, what's happening on Kauai?
Well, as a county council member representing one of 7 on Kauai, I started out when I got elected to try to find out the right to know, like you said. And so I started asking questions about the impacts of the seed industry, the GMO industry on our island. And I started out asking all the companies, so, what are you spraying, what are you growing? And I quickly find out that they won't tell me. They won't tell me what they're spraying, they won't tell me what they're growing. And when they do tell me, unfortunately, I'm getting incorrect information. They're being less than truthful, if I would put it politely. I went to the Department of Agriculture for whatever public information I could get. And this is a binder. There's actually 2 binders. I only hauled one over on the plane of pesticide labels. And I found out that the seed companies, the GMO companies, are spraying restricted use pesticides on a grand scale on Kauai. They told me when I asked, they're spraying whatever, while all the other farmers are spraying. No other farmer on Kauai that grows real food is spraying this kind of pesticides. There's 22 different pesticides, restricted use pesticides. There's experimental pesticide permits. I've tried to get that information. Again, the right to know, it should be public information. The seed companies are denying that information from me. They're actually at first said they're not doing it, but I know they are because the Department of Ag said they are. I've tried to ask for the economic information. You asked what kind of jobs. The companies have put out a report that captured headlines in terms of jobs. I asked for a copy of the actual report. They say that report's not available to me. The impacts are significant, and without the basic knowledge of what they're spraying, what they're growing, there's no way to evaluate those impacts. You know, the direct impacts, the secondary impacts, the cumulative impacts on health and on the environment.
So if you're getting caught between lies, rocks, and hard places, and you're trying to find this information out, and you're getting multiple stories, what's your recourse?
Well, that is an excellent question. You know, the state legislature tried to pass some legislation to deal with this, and they were unsuccessful. You know, if me as a council member is unable to get this information, imagine the regular person on the street. You know, imagine the teacher or the principal when they're spraying outside your school, and you have no right to know what they're spraying. So I'm introducing an ordinance at the county council level requiring the right to know, requiring the seed companies to provide the information, basic information. What are you spraying? What are you growing? Where are you doing it? These chemicals are banned, many of them, in Europe. They're banned in some other states. There's warning signs. 8 of the 22 have direct warnings against bees, against spraying next to streams and schools and that kind of thing. This is the restricted use pesticide. This is 2-3 tons a year, year after year after year. And we're not counting the glyphosates, the Roundups of the world, which is another, you know, you can multiply this by 10. And again, we don't know what they are. You know, there is no way that we can do a proper evaluation without that information. So it's a long struggle, and I wish the companies would cooperate more. I wish they would be more forthcoming with the information that I, as a council member, am asking for the benefit of the public.
Scott, what you just heard from Gary seems to be what we've experienced in the United States for a very long time, that we wait until something is proven to be detrimental before we yank it from the shelves. In Europe, there's a different way of being. There's more of that prescriptive principle that we'll wait and assume that something isn't safe until we prove it is, and then we'll let it go. Is that too simplistic an argument?
Well, I mean, I think the precautionary principle is very strong, and it depends on who you want to be the burden of proof to be on in order for these things to be proven safe or not. And here in the U.S., we tend to veer towards the corporations and allow them to do their own research, show that it is safe, and then give that documentation to the FDA. The FDA that is then supposed to be our watchdog to vet over these things, but frequently the FDA is a revolving door. It has been described as a revolving door for former industry executives who come and go, and therefore can the general public really trust the information that they're getting? And Gary's example is very good, that, you know, we just don't know. There's a lot of things we just don't know, and we're not being told. So
while we just don't know, and we don't seem to be able to have the mechanism to find out, what is it people can do? Are we really stuck, as it seems like we are stuck, and at the mercy of these companies?
Well, this is the fundamental issue, and I think sometimes it's really easy to get lost in the weeds, but the fundamental issue at stake in this right to know movement is the fact that lacking a GMO label on food, only folks who can afford organic ingredients and organic foods can really avoid GMOs if they want to. So what you're doing is you're putting the burden onto the poor folks who cannot afford organic food, and basically making them the sort of guinea pig to the whole equation, because they do not know whether they're buying GMO food. More than likely they are, and as a result, I think it's kind of a tax on the poor.
When you look at how to get a label, which has been part of the discussion that we've heard over the last couple of years especially, we've tried it. The idea was diluted this last session to, well, we can perhaps think about getting a label if something's imported to Hawaii, but not necessarily if it's made in Hawaii, and that's whole food only. Do we have to have several of these go-rounds before we actually are able to agree that in principle we should have a label, not necessarily who gets labeled or what gets labeled, but Don't we need to have an agreement that a label is necessary first?
Well, labeling is nothing new. I mean, everybody knows that everything is labeled. Even politicians are labeled, so you know who the heck you're voting for. So the question becomes, why all of this controversy over something as apple pie as labeling? And that's really the heart of the question, because everything, you know, these companies are doing all in secret. So if you don't have labeling, you can never trace any of the health effects that's happening out there. You don't know why people are getting sick. We know people are unhealthy. We don't know why. And without labeling, we can't trace it back to these guys. All this secrecy stuff goes in their favor. So for us, labeling is a critical solution to this problem. It not only gives us ability to trace it, but it also gives us an ability to be part of the solution. Now the solution is going to your politicians, and those guys, they're not listening for some strange reason, and you know, there's a lot of good reasons why they're not listening, but they're not listening. So we're saying, okay, give the power back to the people. Label it, let the consumer be the power structure that decides this question, not the politicians.
But we also had quite a struggle just to be able to get things like carbohydrates and calories. I mean, simple things labeled and put on the label with a sense of standardization or a uniform code to it, but that wasn't really an issue that happened very quickly either. And this is far greater because it requires greater cooperation. So how do you move? I mean, Walter's saying everybody's labeled, it should be labeled, but it really isn't though, Gary, is it?
It is. It is relatively simple. I think 63 countries in the world already label. The state of Connecticut just passed a labeling law that kicks in when other states pass that also. It is not rocket science. We label for so many things, for gluten, for peanuts, for everything. And the cost would be minuscule. I believe it is the industry, I believe this in my heart, the industry is fighting this so strongly because they were afraid of the negative implications this may cast upon their products. They're not prepared to defend their products in terms of the goodness of them, and they were just deathly afraid that if they're labeled, people won't buy them. But this is not an incredibly hard thing to figure out. Again, many other countries are doing this all over the world. The politicians can make it complicated, the industry can make it complicated, but I know, spending many years in a political environment, if the body wants to pass something, they can figure it out, they can pass labeling that makes sense.
So what you're really saying is there isn't the political will to do this just yet?
Exactly.
Okay, so Scott, if there's no political will to do this just yet, and you're having a greater and greater chasm with politicians over here and people who want to see things labeled over here, do we have to have this escalate to possible not buying of products and to simply saying, no, we're not going to participate?
Sure. I mean, some people are going to organize around boycotts and protests, and there's a lot of great information out there about what products are GMO and what products are not GMO. Take, for example, Wesson, and they put a label of all natural on their Wesson canola oil. There's no regulation around that label.
But that's my point. When we talk about labels, things like the terms all natural, what the heck does that mean? People have been asking that for a long time.
Yeah.
Or how do you really figure out how many of the calories per this or what? I mean, there are so many different ways that we've had to look at labels so that you can find out the information you really want in a simple format. So when Walter and Gary say it's not that simple, it's a little bit more complicated than not that simple.
Agreed. I mean, I think the bottom line is that, as Gary said, it's been done in so many other places. It can be done. Some places do have the political will for it. I believe that Connecticut, Massachusetts, and California will all pass GMO labeling laws at some point. And between those three states, you're looking at, I don't know, a third to a half of the entire U.S. population. And so if Nabisco wants to sell to those populations, they have a choice. They can either label the stuff that goes to those states, or they can label everything.
So what you're really saying is we have to wait for a bellwether state to be able to pass it. We thought California was going to pass it last year, and it fell flat. Gary?
You know, the film ended with stand up. And I would say the answer to political will is for the people to stand up, to speak up, and to show up. Political will follows the community will. And the community has already spoken very loudly this last year, and I'm confident they will continue speaking loudly. And the politicians, elected friends of mine in the Senate and the House, will get it. and they'll realize that labeling is not the end of the world, and it's really a small step. It's a very important step, but it's a small step that the people are demanding.
Because the point of it is that we're not going to see GMO foods go away tomorrow.
No.
It's far too productive. It makes a lot of money, and according to the GMO industry, this is also feeding a lot of people. So creating that balance for you comes right down to squarely producing a label?
The label is a big first step, and I think the general conventional wisdom of genetically modified organisms feed a lot of people, I think, is also incorrect assumption. The Kauai, where we live, the industry itself says that 95% of the product is not for feeding people. It's for feeding cows and for generating corn syrup. And you don't feed the world with ribeye steak and Twinkies. This is about much more than that. And I think for me and for many of us, it's about the impact of our community, on our community of this industry. It's about the amount of pesticides that are going into the ground, into the water, and onto people. More so for me than the broader science question, quite frankly.
But you still have to look at that broader science to be able to make the argument cogent and make it successfully. And when you're looking at soybeans, wheat, corn, those are the three major crops that have heavy GMO influx. That's where they're going. They're not moving to smaller things that we might like to have or think that wouldn't that be interesting. They're looking at what's going to make money and what's going to wind up in most food and what has been popped into most food for decades, and that's probably not going to stop. So at what point do you think we have to have a first step? I mean, what is on your timetable that we have whole food labeled by when?
My approach as a Kauai County Council member is what do I have within my legal authority to do? So I'm focusing on disclosure. I'm focusing on what are the impacts. We need to do an environmental impact statement on how do we regulate the industry in my community. Again, there's 22 different restricted use pesticides, tons of this stuff. They could be growing any crop, but an agricultural, industrial agriculture, putting this much poison into the environment is something that we have to look into, and we have to evaluate the impacts and take steps to protect the public.
That's the science part of it, because there seems to be two avenues of thought. One is simply looking at the pesticides and the deleterious effects of those pesticides. The other part of it is simply the right to know, because it could be a good thing if someone has a piece of GMO fruit. The papaya industry that got saved, for people who love it and think that that's fine, they may be quite happy about it. Other people may say, I'm not so sure about that, but I want to be able to know and make a choice. That seems to be what you're all saying, is let's make a choice, but you're much more concerned about also the effects of the pesticides, and I know you are too.
Yeah, for me, it's the political will is going to follow the will of the people. I like that statement because it's not just the health issues that we're concerned about. We're really, really concerned about the environmental issues. I've come from Molokai, and they say Molokai is the last Hawaiian island. And the indigenous people on that island are bearing the cost of all of this. And
when you say cost, you're talking about human costs, you're talking about not just dollar and cents.
I'm talking about evaporation, condensation, rain. In that rain is not only acid rain, there's chemical rain that's raining on our forests today. And those things go into a water lens. And those things come out on our reefs. So all of these chemicals and stuff are not just on the land and in the dust and in the mud and that's covering our reefs. It's inside of the water system. So our Mauka lands are getting affected, our Uka lands are getting affected, our coastlines are getting affected. And this is the places of the Ahupua'a system, the system that allows us to be Hawaiians in Hawaii today. That whole system is being affected by these farmers, I don't even want to call them farmers, these chemical companies posing as farmers, where they're destroying our soil, turning into dust bowls. And we don't need science to tell us what's going wrong. We can see it with our own eyes.
Agreed. You need to see it with your own eyes, and certainly that's how it starts, in seeing it with your own eyes. But to be able to refute it properly, don't you need to have those tests? Don't you need to have
You get scientists on one side that says
science?
Yes, you got scientists on the other side that says no. They're both being paid by different kinds of people with different interests. They cancel themselves out. Sooner or later, we're going to have to depend on ourselves as people to realize what the hell is going on in our communities.
So what do you want people to do?
They're going to do what they always do, and that's to protect the Aina, to protect the land for the future resources, to protect the things that allow us to be independent and free in the middle of the Pacific.
But there are a lot of people who make the case that that's anything but what has happened, Scott, that we have really not done a very good job of protecting the land, the water, the resources at all, and that we're going to have to come to it with the force of law, and the force of law is going to require that we have the science to back it up.
Yeah, and just as Walter said, there's a lot of scientists that are being funded to produce research, and you don't know who you can really trust. But if you look at the Union of Concerned Scientists, they've produced a couple of great reports on GMOs and have shown that not everything the GMO companies are saying is what it's cracked up to be. There was a great report about papayas. I forget who actually put it together, but the papaya has not been saved by GMOs here in the islands, and in fact the industry is actually kind of collapsing. So it really is, I think the science is there, and if you can find the good unbiased sources of it, I think it supports our side pretty strongly.
Which might mean that you have to look beyond the United States and look at some of the research that's been done elsewhere. Sure. Well, clearly we're not going to solve any of this in 20 minutes. The whole point of it is just to provoke further thought and hopefully further investigation. I want to thank all of you for being here. We're going to have another conversation, and then another one, and we'll see where that all leads us. Thanks very much to our panelists, Scott Cooney, Gary Hooser, and Walter Ritty, for providing their points of view on the downside of GMO. A reminder, be sure to visit olelo.org/GMO to watch both pro and anti-GMO conversations, and send in your questions for our live discussions. We hope you found tonight's program helpful in making informed decisions, maybe just asking some more questions, and staying engaged with the community with the issues that face all of us. I'm Beth Ann Kozlovich for GMO Week on behalf of Olelo Community Media. Thanks for tuning in.